Hi everyone, welcome to Archetypes in the News for March 19th, 2018. Happy Equinox Week. And there's sure a lot we could talk about with the firing of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Deputy FBI Director Andy McCabe, and the increasing pressure on Mueller. But that's not what I want to do this week. We're going to look at Vladimir Putin's natal chart, his transits that correspond to his rise to power, and correlate to the assassinations that took place in 2003 and 2006, and the most recent assassination attempt, March 4th. And we will also take a look, like a lot of people, it's not widely known that Vladimir Putin rose to power on what is most likely a false flag operation. And what we'll do is we'll take a look right now at segments of the PBS documentary that highlights this occurrence in how he came to power. But first I want to contrast Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her comments last week on whether Vladimir Putin is a good actor.
That were put forward.
So is Putin, in simple terms, is Putin a friend or a foe of the United States?
I think that's something that Russia is going to have to make that determination. They're going to have to decide whether or not they want to be a good actor or a bad actor. I think you can see from the actions that we've taken up until this point, we're going to be tough on Russia until they decide to change their behavior.
So that's totally ridiculous, and now we'll see why.
He was so much the KGB man, he would take a turn as head of its successor agency, the FSB, in the year before he became prime minister. Then, 1 month into his new job, in the fall of 1999, this. Bombs obliterated 4 apartment buildings in Moscow and other cities, all blown up at night while people slept. Hundreds died. This was Russia's 9/11. Russian historian Yuri Felshtinsky has written a book on the apartment bombings.
We have to understand that the whole country is very nervous. So that's the feeling is that every several days or like once a week, the building is going to be blown up.
All of a sudden, a prime minister few Russians had heard about was everywhere, swearing revenge.
Будем преследовать террористов везде. В аэропорту. Значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем и в сортире их замочим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
Putin would point to rebels in Chechnya, where a separatist movement was holding ground.
The Russian officials said that there was a Chechen trail in the apartment bombings. Not proof of Chechen involvement, a Chechen trail. It wasn't clear what that meant, but it was used in order to justify a new invasion of Chechnya.
And Putin's invasion would be brutal.
Okay, we're going to fast forward.
But the troubling questions about the bombings were really fueled by what happened here, a few days later, in a town outside Moscow called Ryazan.
A 5th bomb was discovered in the basement of an apartment building in Ryazan by watchful inhabitants of that building. And that bomb was defused. And the people who had placed that bomb in the basement turned out to be not Chechen terrorists. They turned out to be agents of the FSB, the Russian security service.
Tests showed that the bags contained an exclusive military explosive called hexagon. The detonator, too, was military.
I think that the evidence that there was an FSB operation to place explosives in the apartment building in Ryazan is incontrovertible.
At the time, the FSB claimed the Ryazan operation was part of a training exercise. But the broader conclusion that security services could have killed their own people in the other apartments was dismissed by the government. In his biography, Putin called it utter nonsense, totally insane. No Chechens were ever charged. Others arrested were convicted in secret trials, and still others in trials tainted by allegations of forced confessions. But all along, it's been disturbingly dangerous to investigate too closely.
People who tried to investigate the apartment bombings, in many cases, ended up dead. Yuri Shekhatyikhin, Sergei Yushchenkov, Alexander Litvinenko, Anna Politkovskaya.
Now we're going to take a look at the 4 journalists who were assassinated there, and we'll also take a look at Putin's transits and his rise to power, and the current transits and kind of what we can expect over the next few years. So this is Vladimir Putin's natal chart. He's born with a Sun, Saturn, Neptune, Mercury quadruple conjunction that's in a square to Uranus. He's also born with Pluto in a square to Jupiter, and Pluto in a trine to natal Mars. So what we can kind of unpack here is the Sun-Saturn obviously is disciplined, has a lot of control and a need for control. And the Saturn-Neptune you see often with both like a kind of coolness, like Neptune's a stream and flow of consciousness, and Saturn can kind of dampen that down and give it like a coolness about it, not overly hyped. And it's also like the disinformation campaign. Neptune is the image and the way things are perceived, and he has a strong propaganda campaign about himself and who he is, and all of the Russian tactics basically. And Mercury, you see, it's in a square to Uranus. It's a certain level of genius, and in his case, it seems like cleverness and the capacity to manipulate, which you often see. This is a sextile between Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto as well. So Saturn-Pluto sextile is an ease of the control of Pluto is power, and Saturn control, and so there's an easy relationship between those two complexes. And the Jupiter-Pluto you often see with people who have a lot of ambition, who also tend to often be wealthy. It's like that ambition accumulates into power, into wealth. And then he's also born with the trine to Mars, which you see in the shadow form with people who have a violent streak or potentially can actually be assassins. And this definitely fits. Not that he's personally an assassin necessarily, taking the actions himself, but he seems to be ordering them. So yeah, that's just a couple of the major correlations that I see right off the bat that correspond to what we're witnessing. And now we'll take a look at his transits that correspond to his rise to power. So this is the transits for September 4th for the apartment bombing that we just watched the news on. And what we see here is that Saturn was beginning the square to his natal Pluto. So you see that with conservative power control complexes taking place. It's also the Jupiter return. So he's moving just into his beginning of his Jupiter return. So it's like the success of coming to power. And interestingly, the Mars-Pluto conjunction in the sky was opposite his moon. And the moon are other people, the populace. And it seems as though he potentially orchestrated or ordered the assassination of hundreds of Russian citizens with the apartment bombings. And what's interesting is Uranus was in an exact trine or 1 degree trine to his natal sun. So there's a liberating factor, an awakening, emancipation comes from Uranus, and it's liberating his solar identity, who he is. Also with Saturn there, liberating his ability to take control and take power. So those are just the initial transits. And then in 2013, outside of the assassinations that took place that we witnessed, this is when he consolidated power and decided not to put the Russian businesses on the public market. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the head of Yukos. He was the richest person in Russia, head of the oil company, and he wanted to put the companies on the international market so that they would be traded. But in order to do that, you have to say that you're going to have a certain level of corruption. And Putin was unwilling to do that. So he decided, and most of the people voted, to not put their companies on the international market, to go the way of the old Soviet Union and a form of corruption in their economy. And Khodorkovsky was put into a Siberian prison for 10 years. He had Saturn-Pluto transits. I've documented that on a correlations podcast several years ago, so we're not going to go into it now, but that's a really interesting thing that he consolidated power at the same time that he committed these assassinations. So what's interesting is Jupiter was conjoining his natal Pluto and squaring his natal Jupiter, and you see a lot of that with like the rise to power, the consolidation of power, but it's in a trine also to Pluto in the sky. Pluto is trining his natal Pluto, and Jupiter-Pluto trine in the sky. So again, a consolidation of power and empowerment and the kind of courage. There's a lot of boisterous ambition with Jupiter-Pluto to take these actions, to become the leader, and to do it in an oppressive way. So really fascinating. Oh, also Saturn was beginning to square his natal sun. So again, control, taking power, being the authority, all of those things correlate. So then we'll take a look at, this is when he had his second election. It's a long story, but he set it up to where he could have 2 6-year terms after he had 2 4-year terms from 2000 to 2008. He put in Medvedev, a puppet, for 4 years from 2008 to 2012. And then in 2012, he got reelected for a 6-year term. And yesterday, he just got reelected for his second 6-year term. So he'll be in power from 2000 really to 2024. So a dictator for 25 years, basically. And interesting, this is his second Saturn return. It's a reward for all the work he's done and put into becoming the leader of Russia, which you often see with Saturn returns, that type of thing. And this is the beginning of his Pluto square Sun transit that he goes through for the next 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's just ending now, and all for the Russian invasion of Crimea. All this power control, taking power, corresponds to the Pluto square Sun alignment that he has. So this is actually, yes, the invasion of Crimea. This is really fascinating because this Pluto really tightly square the Sun, but it's a Jupiter-Pluto T-square. So like the ambition to take to be able to invade another country, to annex Crimea. And it's interesting because it's not just Pluto's Sun, it's also Pluto square Saturn. And he's also had a double Saturn-Pluto, so he had Saturn square Pluto. Saturn in the sky squares natal Pluto. So you see double Saturn-Pluto here. And what happened because of, the consequences of invading Crimea were sanctions. The sanctions that he is now trying to get lifted through Donald Trump becoming president. And this is just really fascinating. This step of invading Crimea that led to the sanctions. And yeah, so really, really interesting combination. And then here is the election of Donald Trump. Fascinating. Jupiter conjoining his Sun. Obviously a successful operation. He's been told that they were cracking champagne and celebrating when Donald Trump was elected. And again, Pluto square Saturn Sun, the power, taking control, authority, and it's with Jupiter. So it's a successful expression of that. And then the next alignment is the assassination attempt that just took place. And this is interesting because we're moving into the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and there could be a moral backlash from this. There could be a real conservative response, potentially. We'll see what happens. But interestingly, Jupiter is square to his natal Pluto here, and again, a highly ambitious step to assert his power on the world stage. They did this on purpose. Oh, I also should mention that Mars return and Mars trine Pluto. So this is the assassin part of his natal complex that's being activated by Mars and trine Pluto. And obviously it was a successful assassination. He's not dead yet, but he is basically dead. From what I understand, he will never recover. And what's fascinating about this is this took place, interestingly, when Mars is in a square to Neptune. It's 7 degrees or 8 degrees outside of it, but it's been square to Neptune for this past 2-week period when the formation of this idea was set into motion, obviously. And you see a lot of poisonings with Mars-Neptune. Mars is the insult or the assault, the pathogen, and Neptune is drugs, non-ordinary states of consciousness, but it's also the assault from the pathogen. So yeah, really, really interesting correlations there. So now we'll take a look at the 4 journalists who were assassinated. So we'll start with Yuri Shishkin. Shishkin. Sorry, I'm going to butcher the names a little bit, but he is going through Saturn was conjoining his natal Uranus. I'm sure it was a sudden, unexpected assassination. He was actually most likely assassinated with plutonium-210, which is the same substance that killed Alexander Litvinenko, because he died in very similar circumstances. He died 2 weeks after the poisoning. This is the death date, but he was poisoned 2 weeks earlier. And just really interesting that Saturn was on his Uranus sun, but then also Pluto exactly opposite his sun, and then also Mars beginning in opposition to his natal Saturn, and Pluto is just finishing the square to his natal Saturn. So that's a tough complex to go through. And then Sergei Yushkov, he was assassinated. He was the leader of the Russia Liberal Party, so not necessarily a journalist. And I wanted to back up. You see Mercury, Pluto. I mentioned the investigative journalists back in this earlier episode and how many of them had Mercury, Pluto. And again, you hear an investigator journalist who's looking into the research and what happened. He's born with Mercury, Pluto. That's the investigation. But then what I just forgot to mention was that when he got assassinated, this was a week before he was supposed to go to the United States and talk to FBI agents about what he knew about the apartment bombings. So it's very specific as to why he was murdered then. Sergei Yushkov, he was the head of the Liberal Party, and he was speaking out against the apartment bombings as well, and Saturn conjoining his Mercury, Pluto opposite his Mercury. It's a really interesting combination. And then the next person we'll look at is Anna Politskaya. She was actually born in New York City, but she was a Russian citizen, and she devoted the last 7-8 years of her life to investigating the apartment bombings and the Russian war in Chechnya. And again, interesting, she's a Mercury-Pluto person, investigative journalist, and Saturn exactly on her 3 degrees off of her Mercury, and Neptune there as well. But the Pluto conjoining Saturn again. She was assassinated in her elevator, shot 3 times, coming home to her in her apartment building. And again, Saturn silencing the Mercury, the investigative journalist. And square to Mars, meaning the violent death. So that's Anna Politskaya, and then Alexander Litvinenko. So Politskaya was murdered 3 weeks before Alexander Litvinenko, and the week after Politskaya was murdered, Alexander Litvinenko commented on it and said that it was Putin who did it, and he blamed Putin, and he was already he knew about the investigations into the apartment bombings, and he was supporting that. And 3 weeks later, FSB agents show up in London. They meet at a sushi bar. They put plutonium-210 in his tea. He drinks it. He dies 3 weeks later on November 24th. And what's, again, fascinating here is Neptune in the sky opposite his natal Mars, and there's Saturn as well, but Mars in the sky moving into the conjunction with his natal Neptune. This would have been active the whole time during his poisoning for the next 3 weeks until he died. And so you get this Mars, Neptune, Saturn T-square in the sky during that operation and event, and it's also on his natal Neptune and Neptune on his natal Mars. So really fitting, like the poisoning, the altered state of consciousness, but the poison, the drugs are Neptunian, they correlate to Neptune, and Mars is the assault or the penetration of the substance into one system. So really fascinating alignments there. And then, this is the last one with Sergei Skripal, who just took place. Again, I was mentioning this Mars square Neptune alignment was in the sky all through the preparation for this operation. And he was beginning, he had Saturn opposite his sun, opposite his Uranus, sudden unexpected collapse of structures or death. But it's really tight. Saturn will come back to 2 degrees Capricorn and station there opposite his sun. It'll be interesting to see if he actually survives the next 3 weeks. But Mars, again, opposite natal Mars, the attack, the assault. So really, really intriguing correlations, and I felt like they were helpful for kind of contextualizing an understanding of both Putin and what's going on with him, and then all of these events that have a lot of connections with each other and are also very revealing of Vladimir Putin's ambition and desires. So, yeah, I hope everyone's doing well, and we will have lots to talk about next week. It's spring break, so I had a little time off. I'm going to try and go back and respond to some of those comments that I missed. And feel free, again, please, any comments, questions, concerns, discrepancies you may have, please list them in the comments below, and I'll get to them as I can. And yeah, I hope everyone is doing well this week. And again, happy equinox, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, take care.